it is my honor, really, to introduce Jeff Halper to you. Jeff is a Minnesotan, born in Hibbing. He received his undergraduate degree at Macalester and his graduate degree at UW-Milwaukee. In 1973, he went to Israel, and as is the policy, Jewish brothers and sisters can obtain citizenship upon arrival in Israel. So he obtained his citizenship in Israel in 1973, did a number of things, some of them including teaching at Ben Gurion University, and he wants me to make sure that I also talk about his connection with the Quaker Friends. He can tell you more about that institution at which he taught as well. And in about, what? 97. Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. And I have seen his work on the ground when I have visited Israel, Palestine. I really believe this is true. His group gives the best tours when one goes there to understand the situation on the ground in Israel, Palestine. So not only does he educate there, he travels the world. We had trouble getting a hold of this guy. Mary can tell you this. He was doing something in Italy, and I think he got to stop home in Jerusalem and then came here directly from Tel Aviv. So I hope you're not numb anymore, Jeff. We're running him around town, and so I hope he's fully awake, and if he is or not, he'll give us a fabulous presentation. So with that, please welcome Jeff Halper.
Okay, it's good to be here, and I am awake, so I know where I am. Oh, it's good to be back. I mean, I know, it's like usual, I know half the audience, at least. So I feel at home. And in a way, continuing the conversation that we've had over the years. I mean, we've been active for many years. A lot of us have been active. And like Kathy said, we started ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, in 1997. So we've been active on the ground, fighting the occupation, resisting, and so on. But you know, the point of it all is to end the occupation. Or if not to end the occupation, this gets more complicated. We'll talk about that. To resolve the conflict, or to resolve, and it's not even a conflict in many ways. It's kind of a settler colonial situation. But to resolve the situation, the issue in Israel, Palestine, and move on to a just peace. And we haven't turned that corner. By we, I mean Palestinians. Our Palestinian partners, and, critical Israelis. Because, you're not going to liberate Palestine from Minneapolis. That I have a feeling. So in a sense, you need direction, first of all, from Palestinians. I mean, I'm an Israeli. I can bring up, like I'll do today, ideas of where we could be going in terms of resolving this in Israel-Palestine. And I'm certainly a stakeholder as an Israeli. So I have a reason to say what I'm saying, and I'm part of the equation, but I can't represent the Palestinians. And in the end, I think we're going to have to become more proactive, Palestinians and Israelis, there, in terms of giving you all direction and leadership and focus, and a solution to advocate for, more than we have until now. So what I want to do this morning is to sort of, I really should be giving this talk in Ramallah. And if not in Ramallah, in Tel Aviv. Because really the whole idea of where are we going and what should we be advocating for and analyzing it, that's really what we should be doing at home. Unfortunately, we're not. And I'm working with some other people to try to deal with that. But I do want to share with you. So look at it this way. I'm sort of sharing with you my thoughts about where we could be going planting some seeds and kind of, we have to begin to think forward. This has been the most documented, researched, written about occupation or conflict in history. I mean, some of you that have been to Jerusalem know the Educational Bookshop. It's a wonderful bookshop on Salahuddin Street, which is 2 stories filled from floor to ceiling with books and films and reports about Palestine and so on. I don't think there's anything that isn't known. And where we have to begin to go now is beyond that and beyond protest to actually resolving this whole thing. And that's where I'm trying to lead the movement. So the question, where are we headed in Israel-Palestine, is really, I think, the question of the hour. But I do have a new book, called War Against the People. Because this isn't simply a local conflict. In other words, it's great that you're in solidarity with the Palestinians and Israelis that are for just peace and so on. But this is much more than a local Israeli-Palestinian spat. First of all, it's a conflict that's global. I mean, it certainly disrupts the entire international system, certainly the wider Middle East. And in that sense, it impacts on your lives as well. But beyond that, what I try to write about in this new book, War Against the People, is that in fact, Israel is exporting the weaponry, the tactics, the concepts of the new form of warfare today, which is counterinsurgency, or policing, the militarized policing that you have here. The Minneapolis police being trained by Israel. You know, we knew the Ferguson police were trained in Israel. So that part of what I'm trying to also convey is that the occupation is here. This isn't simply a faraway conflict of other people, and it's great, you know, with human rights and politics and so on, to be in solidarity with the Palestinians. But in fact, the occupation is here. And the Twin Cities or Minnesota are complicit in it in terms of the weaponry and the tactics and the training that are developed here together with Israel. And in fact, that Israel is exporting the occupation into the United States and other places. And even more than that, I'll talk about that. I'm trying to kind of put together 2 presentations. Beyond that, what I want to say afterwards is that Israel is also, there's a whole bigger thing. That Israel is exporting not only weaponry and tactics and surveillance systems and security systems and so on, but an entire concept of what a state should be, you know, in an age of terrorism, let's say. You know, the security state. Israel has a concept and a model of a security state that trumps, if we can use that term these days, that trumps democratic processes, civil liberties, due process, where security becomes the absolute value, the absolute preoccupation, and everything else is subsumed to that. And it has very, very attentive ears in the United States, with Hillary Clinton at the lead, actually.
Adore.
And also in Europe and other parts of the world. So in a sense, there's a concept even of moving towards a security state that Israel is really in the lead of developing, and probably has the most developed security state that there is, that should also be on our radar. So in other words, I'm trying to go from the local, which is also important, and of course that's of concern to us as well, but to follow the threads out to what I call global Palestine.
Amen.
And in a sense, looking at Israel-Palestine as a microcosm of what's happening in the wider world, the global north over the global south, and to try to talk about how this is being globalized. So, okay.
But, leaving time, hopefully, for discussion, conversation, arguments, and all of that. I'm not going to, all right, you all know pretty much the conflict. I don't have to start with Israel-Palestine 101 with this crowd. So I want to skip over all that stuff, and I just want to make a contention, and I'll talk for maybe 5 minutes about it. And that is that the two-state solution is gone. It's over, it's dead, and we should stop talking about it. The more you talk about an irrelevant solution, the more you're simply muddying the waters. But I just want to start by saying there was a solution that could have worked. It wasn't a just and fair solution, the two-state solution, obviously, because it took this one country, Palestine, Israel, in which today half the population is Palestinian. In other words, the next 2, 3, 4 years, there will be a Palestinian majority in this country, between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, before any refugees returned. And we've got 5 million refugees living around in terrible situations. Lebanon is awful, but certainly Syria. And a lot of the refugees finding their way to Europe today from Syria are in fact Palestinians. But even before any refugees return, you have a Palestinian majority in this country. And yet the two-state solution, as we know, leaves Israel on 78% of the country. And if the Palestinians got every inch of the occupied territory for a state of their own, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, is only 22% of historic Palestine. So that's not a fair solution, it's not a just solution, but the Palestinians accepted it. Actually, back in 1988, but kind of officially with the Oslo peace process in 93, the PLO, when it represented all the Palestinians under Arafat, accepted the two-state solution. So what we say on the Israeli left is, look, we can't be more Palestinian than the Palestinians. And so we accepted the two-state solution. And we're working on it. That was our program for many years. But certainly, over the last 10 years, it's become clear that the two-state solution is gone. Israel never, ever, ever had the intent of allowing a Palestinian state to emerge, even a small little mini-state like this. And you see it in the Oslo process, and I'm not going to get into all of that. But what Israel claims the entire country, of course, for religious, national security reasons, and can't allow a Palestinian state to emerge. But beyond that, what I'm arguing in my new book is also that Israel has a stake in keeping this because it's a laboratory. It's a laboratory of 4.5 million people that you can basically do anything you want to with, and developing security systems through borders or 600 checkpoints where you have millions of Palestinians passing all the time, weapon systems, tactics of counterinsurgency that Israel's been fighting for 100 years on the Palestinians, and so on. It's a valuable resource for Israel because it allows it to develop those exports that play into what I call a security politics. So that there's a lot of reasons, and I'm not going to get into why Israel will never allow a two-state solution to emerge. And just to be super sure, Israel has laid over, and you've heard me talk about this before, has laid over the occupied territory what I call a matrix of control. In other words, facts on the ground that are so massive and so permanent that they basically eliminate any possibility of any coherent Palestinian state from emerging. Israel has fragmented the territory so that 95% of the Palestinians today in the West Bank live in these little islands of areas A and B under Palestinian Authority control, but it's only on paper. Israel, invades at will. areas A and B. And Gaza, of course, which remains a cage. So altogether, if you take A, B, and Gaza, we're talking about maybe 40% of the occupied territory, where 95% of the Palestinians are locked in. So that we can say that today, the Palestinians are locked into 40% of 22% of their country. And that fragmented into, of course, dozens of little islands. There's about 70 islands of areas A and B. So it isn't like a 40% block. It's 40%, but in all kinds of truncated little islands, all surrounded by Area C, the grayish areas in which the settlements are. The 62% of the West Bank, under full Israeli control, you see, that surround all the little islands, and you can see how tiny some of them are, of A and B, and where the blue blotches are, these are the settlements. About 200 settlements, 600,000 Israelis living in the occupied territory. Now, can you imagine Hillary Clinton and the American Congress demanding that those 600,000 people are removed and moved back into Israel proper? I don't think it's going to happen. So that the settlements, and of course the pink areas here are what we call settlement blocks. So the discrete settlements, and the word settlement is a bad word because it minimizes the reality. A settlement sounds like a couple shacks on a hillside. In fact, we're talking about satellite cities. Ma'ale Adumim is about 50,000 people. Upper Modi'in, as it's called, is about 80,000 people. Pisgat Ze'ev, Neve Yaakov in northern Jerusalem is 120,000 people. We're talking about large satellite cities, urban areas, that are now in these settlement blocks, you see, are being consolidated. So the discrete settlements are being put together into larger urban areas, all facilitated by a whole matrix of highways. 28 major highways that completely incorporate the West Bank into Israel. In fact, the two-state solution, is based on a north-south axis. You have Israel, and alongside of it, a Palestinian state. So in order to eliminate that completely, Israel over the years has built east-west. You see, a greater Jerusalem that links up to Modi'in. This is actually the second largest city. A whole megalopolis is developing like this. And of course, this way as well, through Ariel into the Jordan Valley, so that basically it breaks that north-south axis, and there is no more coherent Palestinian territory that could ever be detached. So that the whole country has been reconfigured, and I would argue, and it's problematic to argue this, I know, but I'm starting to argue that there is no more occupation. Occupation is defined by the international community, by international law, as a temporary military situation. And an occupation has to be disposed only by negotiations. Well, after 50 years, and all these massive facts on the ground, and the incorporating of the West Bank into Israel proper, I would argue this is permanent. In fact, Israel has transformed the West Bank into Judea and Samaria. The biblical term that Israel uses, and there is no more West Bank. There certainly is no more East Jerusalem. That was annexed by Israel 50 years ago. There are more Israelis living in East Jerusalem than there are Palestinians. And so I think we have to go beyond the words occupation and to say there is no more occupation. That in fact, we're talking about one state. And I'll talk about that in a second. So that there's a concept that's very important, I think, that we use. We don't use it often. Partly because it doesn't have a legal reference, like apartheid or occupation. And that's the term Judaization. That's an official, one reason why people don't use it is it sounds vaguely anti-Semitic. If you're not Jewish, you start talking about Judaization, But in fact, it's an official term that's used by the Israeli government. They say in their policy statements and plans, we are Judaizing Jerusalem. We are Judaizing the Galilee. Judaization is a policy of the last century of Judaizing Palestine, meaning to transform Palestine into the land of Israel. And I would argue that the Judaization process of the last 50 years, focused on the West Bank, has succeeded. It's over. The West Bank has been Judaized and is today Judea and Samaria with these little Palestinian islands in it, and that today the process is complete, and in fact, there is one country today. And in case you still didn't get the message, in case you're J Street and you're still hanging on to the two-state solution, and there are Palestinians that are hanging on to the two-state solution for different reasons as well. Israel built a wall. All right, what do we have to do to convince you that it's not going to happen? Can we do anything more? We built a wall that, as you know, is 5 times longer than the Berlin Wall, more than twice as high. If you've ever been to Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, you know the Berlin Wall was about 12 feet high. When you look at it, it's a little disappointing, kind of. You know, the Israeli wall is 26 feet high. And the Berlin Wall was linear. So, you know, there were 2 sides to the wall. This wall, of course, imprisons. It creates cells, larger cells or smaller, tiny cells in which all the Palestinians are imprisoned. It's not a wall. It's not a wall in the sense of the Berlin Wall, a wall. It's a wall in the sense of a prison that encompasses and encloses and imprisons a population. And it's also a very clear indication in concrete of how Israel sees the borders of the country. So that it's clear that you see, you have the line of the wall this way, so that the wider Jordan Valley will all be incorporated into Israel. And here's a settlement block here and here. And it goes around this way, of course, and the wall both imprisons the Palestinians, but at the same time it annexes and incorporates these large settlements like Ariel here into Israel itself, and Greater Jerusalem, and so on. So that basically the Israeli concept is cantons. This is a term that Sharon used to use. A Palestinian canton in the north, a canton in the center, a canton in the south, and Gaza. This adds up to apartheid. It adds up to apartheid. But I would argue that it's worse than apartheid. And many South Africans, including Desmond Tutu and Ronnie Castril and others, argue that as well. In other words, it's hard to say something good about apartheid. But under the apartheid regime, there was at least lip service, a pretense of relating to the black African population. I mean, South Africa admitted that it existed, a black African population. And they tried to set up, these crazy Bantustans that no one ever accepted, but at least there was the pretense of giving independence to black African peoples. In Israel, you don't have that. Even that pretense, even that lip service. Israel has never, ever, ever recognized the existence of a Palestinian people. Never. And it's certainly never recognized their national rights. In Oslo, the brightest days of the Oslo peace process, all Israel did was recognize the PLO as a negotiating partner. And what are we negotiating? Who knows? It was open-ended negotiations, and so that you have a situation in which Israel has imprisoned the Palestinians. The term that I use, it comes from the United States, is warehousing. And warehousing is where we are here, which is worse than apartheid. Warehousing is a term that Angela Davis and people involved in the prison industrial complex in the United States have developed. You know, the United States has 4% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. And they're warehoused. They're wards of the state. They've disappeared. They're not an issue. Nobody knows, nobody cares. And they're inmates. So if they, and we use non-political language for inmates, when they riot, the guards, the prison guards, have every right and duty to put down the riot. You see? Well, I would submit that that's exactly the way Israel looks at the Palestinians. Exactly. They're inmates. They have no national identity. They're not even Palestinians. They're Arabs. They're a bunch of Arabs, you know, led by terrorists and kind of being terrorists, who were justifying negotiations with them or a two-state solution. So what I'm saying is, that we have this conflict, or we have this situation, it's more than a conflict, that has, I think, mathematically three solutions, if you want to put it that way. One solution is the two-state solution, which again could have worked, but it's gone. It's over. I mean, it was never alive, but certainly with the facts on the ground and the matrix and everything else, it's over. It'll never be. So we can eliminate, and Israel eliminated that. That's one of the important points here. This isn't an Arab plot. The Arabs didn't frustrate the two-state solution. This is the deliberate, conscious, systematic rejection of the two-state solution by Israel. We have to hold Israel accountable. And this is actually the most threatening thing to Israel, because Israel presents itself as the victim. You know, we're the ultimate victims. And if you're a victim, if you think about it, if you're a victim, that's a very powerful place to be when you're in a political struggle, because you can't be held accountable for anything you do. You're not responsible because you're the victim. So if you can combine, like Israel does, tremendous military power. You know, Israel's the fourth largest nuclear power in the world and has never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's been an occupying power for 50 years. You combine unlimited political and military power with the fact that you have no responsibility. You're the victim. So I'm the powerful oppressor, but I'm also the victim. It means you're home free. You can't be, and of course that means then that we blame the victims. I mean, Edward Said called the Palestinians the victims of the victims. You see, and you end up blaming the Palestinians for all of this. And what's most threatening to Israel is when we say Israel is accountable for this. Israel has done this. And what Israel has done is eliminate the two-state solution. Okay. So option one is gone. What's option two? Option two is apartheid, or warehousing, actually. Warehousing. Imprisonment. This is where we are today. The Palestinians have been imprisoned, and Israel de facto, soon I think to be de jure, has expanded from 78% to 85% of the country. And the Palestinians have been locked into these prison cells. And Israel believes that it's won. It's over. The conflict is over. We win. The international community can live with this. Certainly Hillary Clinton can live with this. Not to mention Obama and Bush and everybody else. And we're home free. In other words, there is on the horizon absolutely no hint of sanctions against Israel for anything. You know, every time it establishes a new settlement, the State Department says that's unhelpful. And that's about as bad as it gets. So Israel knows that as long as it has two actors in its pocket, it can do anything. One of the actors, of course, is the American Congress. Not the president, not the government, but the Congress. And both parties are pretty much are in Israel's pocket, not pretty much. You don't know, because you don't get news in this country. But at the height of the last assault on Gaza in 2014, at the beginning of August, at the height of this assault, where $2 billion of infrastructural damage was done in a place that nobody even knew had $2 billion left of infrastructure. 18,000 homes demolished, 2,000 people killed, 85% of whom were civilians. At the height of this assault of a major Western army using American weapons, F-35s, F-16s, all kinds of American missiles and so on. An assault on Gaza. At the height of this assault, the Senate passed a resolution supporting Israel. Okay, well, that's not surprising. It would have been shocking if it had been the other way. What's shocking is the vote. You know what the vote was? 100 to nothing. 100 to nothing. 100 American senators signed this resolution to Obama supporting Israel at the height of the Gaza assault. So we're including Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and your Al Franken, and take the most liberal senators you could think of. You know, when the United States went into World War II, declaring war on Japan, it wasn't unanimous in the Congress. This was unanimous. So that Israel looks at that and says, hey, what do we have to worry about? From that, all right, let's say 3 senators, let's say Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Al Franken decide that they're going to support the Palestinians, which isn't going to happen. Okay, so we're left with 97. We can live with that. In other words, it has Congress that completely restrains the president, but at the same time, Israel has Germany in the EU. So Germany keeps the EU in line. As long as you have just those 2 players, you're home free. Israel believes it can sustain warehousing in a way that South Africa couldn't. So this is option 2. This is where we are, and this is where Israel wants to stay. Now, I would assume, I think it's an easy assumption, that that's not acceptable to us, which leaves option 3. The problem is, we're not articulating option 3. If you ask us, well, what do you want? We don't have an answer. Option 3 for me is this, and that's what I want to talk about for just a couple minutes. And the framing is important, because we've got to hold Israel accountable. But this is an alternative that Israel has forced on us. And that is this, if the electric current cooperates. We say to Israel, okay, you, Israel, you eliminated the 2-state solution. You created one state. There is today one state in Israel-Palestine, Palestine-Israel. There's one state. In other words, you can't get to anywhere in this country without going through Israeli borders, or at least here in Rafah, Israeli security people. You can't get into the country without going through Israeli security. Obviously, there's only one government. I mean, you can't tell me the Palestinian Authority is a really functioning government with authority. There's one government over this entire country. There's one army, obviously. There's one electrical system. There's one water system. There's one highway system. There's one currency. Whether you're in Gaza or Hebron or Tel Aviv, you're using the shekel, which is regulated by the Bank of Israel. So by any measure, this already is one country. Okay, So what we have to say to Israel, I think, is, fine, we accept that. You've turned this into one country, one state, we go with that, we agree. But it cannot be an apartheid warehoused country, of course. So it seems to me, at least, that the way forward is crystal clear. And that is, how do we transform the one apartheid state that Israel has created into a democratic state of equal rights for all its citizens? That seems to be the only way that Israel has left us, but the only just solution. Now, that shouldn't be such a hard sell in the United States. Oh, democracy. Why didn't we think of that? You know, you've got your armies running around the world bringing freedom and democracy to peoples that don't really want them. You know? Well, here's the people, the Palestinian people, that are saying, hey, you know what? We'd like a little freedom and democracy. That wouldn't be so bad. And what are we saying? No. No, you're the exceptions. Everybody else has to have freedom and democracy or we'll go to war with you. But the Palestinian people that want some freedom and democracy can't have it because we're for Israel, which means basically there is no Palestinian people, there are no Palestinian rights. So I think we have to break through that, and I think an American discourse would help, you know, putting this in an American framing, but also holding Israel accountable. To say this is where we are, and this solution is the only solution that's been left to us by Israel. And that, I think, puts Israel on the defensive. So that's what I would talk about with one proviso. And here it gets, naturally, there's got to be a complication, a catch to the whole thing. There's one proviso here that's more difficult. You know, if you talk about one democratic state, most Palestinians would agree to that. I mean, that's been the Palestinian project forever, really. And many Israelis on the left would agree to that. But the problem with it is that just that formulation alone ignores the national elements here. This is not Kansas, where we're just a bunch of voters. You know, there are two national groups in this country, Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews. Now, whether there should be or shouldn't be is another question. That we have to bracket. The political reality is there are two groups, and we can't ignore that. And so what I'm advocating is one democratic state that's a binational, in which it's accepted and acknowledged and built into the system that this is a country of two national groups, and they each have rights of self-determination. To have their identities, to have their institutions, their languages, and so on. And there's precedence for this. Canada is one. Canada is a binational state, in a sense, national in a wider sense of Anglophiles and Francophiles. And Quebec has an empowered parliament, and the French language, and you might even say it's a triple national if you bring in the First Nations into the Canadian equation. Britain is a country that has four nations in it. The English, the Scots, the Northern Irish, and the Welsh. And they're all very proud peoples. I mean, believe me, the Scots are no less nationalistic than the Palestinians are. And so far, we'll see what happens with Brexit. But so far, these four nations, with their parliaments, with their identities, their languages, and so on, have lived together in one democratic state. Gordon Brown, who was the Prime Minister of the UK, was Scot. You know, so that there's a certain equality among those nations. Spain is another example. We have the Spanish and the Catalonians and the Basques and others. So this isn't the first place, the only place in the world that has that kind of reality. The problem is, of course, that we're not quite there at a solution. We don't have it agreed upon. I mean, I'm raising this a democratic binational state, but we're far from any consensus about that. And the Palestinians don't agree. I mean, the idea of binationalism gets a lot of pushback on the part of the Palestinians, especially in the occupied territory or in the camps. Because for Palestinians, many Palestinians, to accept the principle of binationalism smacks of legitimizing Zionism or legitimizing settler colonialism, which is how they see Zionism. So they're not there yet. So, you know, I'm trying to raise these issues and raise this discussion, but I certainly can't say, okay, this is where we're going, because we're far from an agreement. So before then we jump to a solution, I'm saying, why don't we sit down, Israelis and Palestinians, that we're not doing, actually, but we should, pretty urgently, sit down and work out, okay, what are the elements that have to go into any just peace? Let's leave aside 1 state, 2 states, 10 states. What elements have to be included in any peace? And at least we would identify what we agree on and what we disagree on. And these are the elements that I've come up with, at least, you know, just to start the discussion. 2, I mean, they're pretty self-explanatory. I'll just mention 2 quickly. The first one is the hard one. Finding a balance between individual rights isn't the problem, the collective rights. Getting the Palestinians to acknowledge the existence of an Israeli national identity within the country. And of course the other way around as well. Getting Israelis to acknowledge a Palestinian presence, a Palestinian national identity. But I think this is, and I'll talk about this in a second, this is one. The other one, of course, is the refugee issue. That's absolute. I mean, I don't have to persuade anybody here, but the right of return is absolute. You'll never get anywhere, unless refugees have the right of return. They can choose, of course. If they don't want to return, there'll be financial compensation, they can be resettled. But those who want to return, return. And not only return, but there also has to be a symbolic healing process. You know, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. In other words, the Palestinians will not return. And this issue will not be resolved unless Israel acknowledges what it did in 1948, and Israel also recognizes the right of return. This isn't a humanitarian gesture. We're letting Palestinians come back because we're nice people. But that there's a right to return, Palestinians have the choice to return or not, and that Israel acknowledges what it did. If those are the symbolic kind of pieces of it that are no less important than the actual return. And then the return would mean, I'm not going to get into details, but it would mean, of course, negotiating a land redistribution. You know, Israel's taken most of the country. Financial compensations, resettlement issues, integrate. I mean, there's a lot of things to talk about, but I think this is an absolute. And then the other things are pretty. So let me just show you one thing that's kind of cute. Because I've really been trying, I'm really trying to kind of elaborate these ideas. Because the more concrete we can be, the more we can really have substance to our discussions. This is how I would see a binational democratic state, just to share it in 2 minutes. First of all, it would be a consociational democracy. If anything, you came out with a new word. You know, in your cocktail parties, you could talk about consociation. Which basically is a fancy word for sharing. Not like Lebanon, where everything is divided by community, but a sharing in which you create a mutual dependency. That if it's good for everybody, it's good for everybody. But if one community loses, or is oppressed, or unhappy, or whatever, the whole system suffers. You know, so that you try to create a kind of a win-win sort of thing. Now, two things I'll just mention. One is that it would have a very weak executive. You know, the problem we have is there is no Palestine-Israel, Israel-Palestine. There's no common overarching identity. So even before the end of apartheid, Nelson Mandela could say we're all South Africans, right? Because there was a concept of South Africa. We can't say we're all what? You see? And so in a sense, we resemble to some degree what Switzerland was about. Because in Switzerland, the cantons, the German-speaking, Italian-speaking, French-speaking, and so on, the cantons were stronger in terms of identities and languages and traditions and so on than some broad Swiss identity. So when I'm in Germany, which borders Switzerland, I ask people, like an audience like this, who's the Prime Minister of Switzerland? Nobody knows. In Germany, no. I mean, I don't expect you to know, but nobody. I mean, Americans don't know where Switzerland is necessarily. Nobody knows. And it turns out that they don't have a prime minister. They have a president. Who knows who the president of Switzerland is? Nobody knows. And in fact, they don't have one president, they have 7. Because it rotates from canton to canton. There's a rotating, what they call a federal executive. My point is that you can have a very functioning state, I mean Switzerland does pretty well, a functioning state in which there is no consensus over who the state belongs to. Or there's no overarching common identity. But that you can take these specific identities and there's ways of putting them together. So I'm talking about something like a rotating technocratic executive rather than a prime minister or something like that could rotate between Palestinians, Israelis, and then I'll talk about that in a second. So that's sort of one idea, to have, in a sense, a weak state where the state doesn't represent a common identity, because that would be forced on the people. There is no right now common identity. Maybe someday there will be. You know, in Switzerland, what's happening now is that the young people are leaving the cantons. The young people are young people. And there's multi-language universities in Switzerland. They feel European, even though Switzerland's not a part of the EU, but they feel European. And that whole system, they're starting to move, which they can, move into a more general Swiss-European identity. So that would be hopefully what I would like to see happen in Israel-Palestine, but we're not there yet now. Now, the key is then to have 2 houses of parliament. One would be a normal parliament. This is like Congress here. A normal parliament elected by the citizens, all citizens of Israel, Palestine, Palestine, Israel, equal rights, equal votes. We simply vote for a parliament, and it has all the powers of a parliament. Except, and here you have this in every country. In the United States, you have a constitution. And in the Constitution, you have the Bill of Rights and that constrain Congress. In other words, Congress can't pass any law it wants to pass. Because you've got the Supreme Court occasionally says, no, this law is unconstitutional. So every parliament has certain legal parameters, and here it would be the issue of binationalism. In other words, you'd have a constitution that we don't have today in Israel. Israel's the only country in the world with no constitution, except Britain, that has the Magna Carta. So, but we'd have a constitution, and embedded in the constitution would be the principle of binationalism, which would mean that Parliament cannot pass laws that harm the integrity of either national group. You see, it's because the fear of Israelis, and it's a real fear, Israeli Jews, is there'll be a Palestinian majority in this country. What would prevent it from becoming Algeria? where Parliament passes laws, to drive the Jews out, let's say. What would prevent the tyranny of the majority? And Israel knows very well what the tyranny of the majority is, because that's what we do to Palestinians today with our parliamentary majority. So that the principle of binationalism would protect both national groups, but obviously the Israeli group more, because they would be the minority. And what I'm saying, and then you'd have another house, so in every election you get 2 votes. And this is actually a leaf I take out of the book of New Zealand, because New Zealand does it this way with the Maori. And that is that if you belong to the Israeli Jewish community or the Palestinian Arab community, you would have votes within your community for this other communal House of Parliament. That would be the watchdog over the parliament in terms of protecting the national collective rights of each of those peoples. And maybe even addressing the problems that these communities have. And that would give another layer of protection to everyone. And I think if the principle of binationalism was in there, I think you could sell this to the Israeli public. The Israeli public, the Israeli Jewish public, is not concerned about the land. They never bought into the greater land of Israel idea that we talked about. In fact, the ideological settlers, the ones we think of as settlers, the religious ones that are violent towards Palestinians and so on, they're only 1% of the Israeli population. That's it. And if you take all the settlers, well, most of them aren't ideological. If you take all the settlers, they're less than 10% of the Israeli population. Now, it's true, they have the patronage of different parties, but the Israeli people have never really gone there. So I think their concern is security. Both personal security, but also our collective security. And you can address that, I think, with this principle of binationalism. So let me leave you with this piece with a slogan. I made up a slogan, and you're a captive audience, so let me sell it to you. We've always supported BDS, our organization. As a matter of fact, we supported BDS before it was called BDS. If you remember, the first de facto BDS campaign was against Caterpillar for developing bulldozers and stuff that destroyed Palestinian homes. So the house demolition issue was the first campaign that started what became the BDS movement. So we've always supported BDS. I've had problems over the years with its targeting. I'm not so sure SodaStream was the best target. And we can talk about that later if you want. But the problem with BDS is it's not connected to an end game. Again, you can't be in a political struggle and not have an end game. What are you BDSing for? Are we BDSing to hurt G4S? Or to get SodaStream to move out of Mali? That's really what we care about? Why are we BDSing? And the 3 things we're BDSing for of the BDS campaign: end the occupation, equal rights for Palestinians in Israel, and the right of return, are old and outdated. They were formulated in the year 2000. You're not going to end the occupation, I would argue, because there is no more occupation. And talking about the rights of Palestinians in Israel, which is good by itself, kind of, when you talk about occupation in Israel, you've got, it's a 2-state solution concept behind these things, which is old and I think outdated. So we have to rethink that. And so I would like to put together these things, BDS for BDS. In other words, boycotts, divestment, sanctions for a binational democratic state. I think it gives a focus and a direction to where we could be going. And I'm throwing this out, to kind of give us that direction in our talk. Now, just one more thing, I promise. I mean, I can talk for another 3 hours, you know that. But it has to do with my new book and where we can, I just want to at least touch on this. And that is, again, that what should also concern Americans is the fact that Israel is exporting the occupation to the U.S. and everywhere else in the world, basically. But also, you know, the left, I mean, look, I wrote a book about something I know nothing about, which makes it interesting. I mean, you know, I'm out of the box. It's kind of, I'm learning. What do I know about the military? I mean, I couldn't tell you an F-35 from a pistol. I mean, I've never been interested in it. Police, less so. But, you know, I started to trace the threads. And I was asking myself, first of all, how does Israel get away with this?
Yeah.
Is one question. The other question is, why didn't Israel accept the two-state solution? What's going on here? Why is it insisting on holding on to Tulkarm and Gaza? What's the, you know, and as you trace it, you begin to see that, in fact, like I said at the very beginning, the occupied territories are a laboratory. Develop weapons and tactics and surveillance systems. And what I discovered was that if you take the military and homeland security and policing together, because they've all become one package today. You've got the militarization of the police, but you also have the policification of the military. I mean, the militaries are going around doing nation building and regime change and peacekeeping, so-called, you know, so that all these things are coming together. The military, security, and policing. If you take them together, you know, they represent a $3 trillion a year industry. Whoa, I'm saying to myself, here I'm an activist. I want to make the world a better place. And I don't know anything about a $3 trillion industry of violence and control and repression. Whoa, that's kind of a blind spot. You know, and I think this isn't on the agenda of the left at all. And that's one reason why I wrote the book. We talk a little bit about drones. Code Pink and media have done some of the work on drones. I mean, but that's just one little tiny thing. The whole issue of the military and security and policing is not really on the agenda of the left, partly because we, and I put myself at the head of the line, don't know anything about it. And so I wrote this book following Israel as this vehicle for kind of getting into this. And you can see the, you know, this is what I call security politics. You know, if you look at normal international relations, you know, we talk about international relations and countries have national interests, and that's how we try to look at the world as a group of countries, everybody pursuing their interests, and then you have allies and you have enemies, and wars are fighting between armies on battlefields. That's not the way the world works anymore. The world is, it's a transnational world in which I put this also within the framework of capitalism. Capitalism we can't ignore. The capitalist system's in crisis, especially neoliberalism, tremendous income disparities, the vast majority of humanity is being excluded and marginalized and impoverished, including our own kids, if you look at the Occupy movement. And in this repression era of capitalism, you know, the capitalism loves, you know, has always worked on consensus. Ronald McDonald and Hollywood and our toys, and we were all part of that. But today, as more and more people are impoverished, downwardly mobile, excluded, you know, 80% of the people of this world live on less than $10 a day. 80% of the people. So in this situation, capitalism has got to be more and more repressive. And as it becomes repressive, this is the rise of what I call wars against the people. They're not wars of armies and governments. And in wars against the people, who is the most experienced, if not Israel? You know, you have the Pentagon. Well, the Pentagon is still fighting wars against the Soviet Union. The F-35, this trillion-dollar airplane, is an irrelevant weapon. Are you going to go fight the Taliban in Kabul with an F-35? You know, but the American economy is locked into these big, expensive, sexy weapons, and so when you're really fighting wars, you tend to go, including internal security wars, where many of us are terrorists or getting close to being terrorists in the views of the authorities, and so on. You go to, so that's the niche, the huge niche that Israel has. And what I'm suggesting, and I'll end on this, is that Israel, again, is developing not only the weapons and tactics that our police forces are using, not only our militaries, but also a concept of a security state, again, in which security trumps everything else. At any rate, it's a part of what I call globalizing Palestine. There's a lot more I could say about it, which I'm going to be compassionate and not. But at any rate, this is also a direction in which, you know, and part of why I'm doing this as well is because all our issues tend to be siloed. So people involved in Israel-Palestine are Israel-Palestine. You know, and when I go to speak, you know, people are saying to me, you can sell your book, you can talk about your book for a couple of minutes, but we're not interested. We want to hear Israel-Palestine. You know, and then people involved in climate change are into climate change, and that's what they want to hear. They don't want to hear. So Naomi Klein, who I love, Naomi Klein wrote her latest book, This Changes Everything, about climate change. Didn't mention the military. The military is the world's largest polluter, by far. Amen. But it's all siloed, you see? And then people dealing with military stuff are in their world. People in women's issues are in their world. Third world debt is another world. You know, and nobody's connecting the dots. So hopefully what I'm trying to do here is begin to connect some dots, and also to widen the Israel-Palestine issue by talking about global Palestine, to begin to include people that today aren't sitting with us. You know, there's a lot of activists out there in the Twin Cities that aren't in this room because they don't see this as their issue. And we have to try to break that as much as we can. So I'll leave it at that, and we have time for arguments.
So I just ask respectfully that we limit what we have to say to 2 minutes. And I saw this lovely lady in the green with her hand up first, so I'm going to just hand it to her.
I might kind of break your first rule already about a question, but I'll build in a question. And I want to just highlight this notion of what I'd call balkanization of issues. And if we can put up that last slide that you had about the globalization of Palestine, it would be helpful. Because I'm actually the cultural director of ACOM, which is the Armenian Cultural Organization of Minnesota. And we had a big visit by ANCA, Armenian National Commission of America, last week. And one of the things that I always talk about in terms of the Armenian community is its automatic tie with Israel and Israelis because of the genocide. And there's a long-standing going back. There are lots of, the Armenian community always has people like Amy Klobuchar and other people come as an ally. And I'm just looking right up there to that. Turkey and Azerbaijan, I'll point out Azerbaijan's misspelled, but with Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan getting $4 billion of arms, and that's the only direct military thing we have going on right now, but in Armenia with Nagorno-Karabakh. And that is, so I think that, I don't guess Armenia gets any money. But anyway, I just wanted to point out that it's something I'm constantly trying to do.
No, Israel's on the Azerbaijani side
Exactly.
of the conflict with Armenia.
And yet Armenia claims, these ties with Israel and the Jewish community. I'm always trying to get people to consider the Palestinian plight as actually the most directly related to questions of Armenia today and in the past. So how would you recommend, I'm going to share this slide with everybody if I can get it.
You're welcome.
But how can we sort of get outside of these old allegiances that are seen as sort of infallible to go beyond what's happening now? There.
Well, that's where capitalism comes in. And I know we say capitalism, and ruling classes, and it sounds kind of 50-ish. You know, old Marxist stuff, and I mean, certainly, to her, Naomi Klein is probably the only popular writer that uses the word capitalism. I mean, some academics do, but it's not a part of our discourse. And it sounds crazy, leftist, conspiratorial, but you know, there is a capitalist system, and there are ruling classes. And in fact, Oxfam put out a report a few months ago that in fact, 1% of the world's population controls 50% of the world's resources. I mean, you can get statistics about how people are being made surplus labor, surplus humanity, marginalized. I mean, it's all there. Okay. The point I'm trying to make is that the world is becoming trans-global. So the way we think of the world in terms of peoples and especially in terms of countries is old. And the ruling classes, which is true, the ruling classes of the world tend to be concentrated on the North Atlantic, but you've got very, very important elite populations, the transnational elites in other countries. You know, one of the richest guys in the world is this guy Slim from Mexico. I mean, certainly China has a whole class of oligarchs. So does Russia. So that the ruling classes are over to a certain degree. The point I'm making is that they're loyal to the bottom line. They're loyal to their profits. They're transnational. They don't have allegiances anymore to a particular country. So when Trump gets up and rails about, well, I want to bring jobs back to America and all of that, I mean, it's his own, actually it's him too, because he's a super outsourcer. But this whole idea of outsourcing jobs and moving to the cheapest places and making profits, that's where the loyalties are. Not to, you know, the GM doesn't have loyalties, as Michael Moore showed in his first film, Roger and Me. You know, GM isn't loyal to Flint, Michigan. GM is loyal to its stockholders. So we have to begin to look at, I mean, economically it's easier, but in other ways, look at the way the elites are beginning to work in a transnational way. And so the elites of Azerbaijan, why Azerbaijan? Well, Azerbaijan specifically is a jump-off place to Iran for Israel. So that's where Israel that's where Israel launches its satellites from, its spy satellites from Azerbaijan. But there's a lot of Azerbaijanis that live in Iran. And so Azerbaijan is a major military base. Israel has 2 military bases. It's not like the United States that has 174 countries with military bases. But Israel has 2, both in Muslim countries, which is interesting. One in Azerbaijan and one in Eritrea. So, you know, what's interesting here again is how the allegiances we think about, we talk about the Arab-Israeli war, or these allegiances are simply not true. Israel and Saudi Arabia have a love affair today because they're sharing common interests. Economic, against the Shiites and Iran, against an Arab Spring, and so on. Well, on the basis of countries and ideologies, you wouldn't expect that. You'd think these are 2 completely polarized countries that should be enemies in the old sense. But again, if we begin to shift and look at transnational, and especially with this capitalist thing, you begin to follow the money, and follow the power, and follow the arms that are probably a $3 trillion industry is one of the best threads to follow when you're looking at interests. And they're not national interests, but they're class interests. And today we're at a point where the countries, the elites of the political elites, are following the economic elites. The political elites make things easier. I mean, Boeing doesn't have an army. So the United States has an army, but it puts its army at the disposal of Boeing and the transnationals. So that's what I'm saying. We have to look, if we begin to adopt a more global analysis and it's more fluid, and we begin to look at these things, we begin to understand more how power is flowing through here, rather than doing it country and people by people and so on.
Now, it seems to me that the transnational security state that Israel is trying to take to the rest of the world is based on fear. And fear in today's context is terrorism. We started thinking about terrorism a long time ago with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and now terrorism has become kind of worldwide since 9/11 and the launch of the war on terrorism. And
Or what's called terrorism.
what's called terrorism. And we've become a security state based on the events of 9/11. Now, when you look at 9/11, there is a very strong Zionist fingerprint on a lot of the things surrounding 9/11. And I'm wondering how you see the 9/11 situation and the war on terrorism that is rolled out from that fitting into this overall context of the transnational security state that you're talking about.
Look, I don't really subscribe to the 9/11 Zionist Israel thing. I know there's pictures of Israelis dancing on a rooftop in Brooklyn, and there's this idea that 4,000 Jews didn't go to work that day at the World Trade Center, you know, as if they knew and Israel was tipping them off. We have to be careful, and this is something that I'm really aware of. We have to be careful to separate our analysis from conspiracy thinking. And, you know, it's hard because in the world we live in, the nutty conspiracies are just about as plausible as reality is. I mean, you look at the world of Trump and Cheney, I mean, you know, conspiracy is kind of mainstream. But we have to be really careful about that because conspiracy theory tends to be very neat, where everything falls into place, and it leads us to certain enemies. And what I'm trying to say here is the problem isn't this enemy or that enemy. Terrorism is a political tool in order to generate fear, in order to create a security state. You know, when you go to the airport and they say, or you go to the train stop here, and so and the media, for example, that help form our language, like terrorism, and they channel it to a particular enemy. Zionism, the Masons, the Pope, you know, the Rothschilds, whoever the conspiracy is of today. So that it's very, in a sense, it's a tool, I think, to divert our attention from a real analysis of what's really going on. And of course, the word terrorism is a loaded term because it only applies to non-state actors. See, so the states are off the hook. There's a very interesting book by a guy named Rummel. Not that Rummel, an American Rummel, R-U-M-M-E-L, who was a professor in Hawaii, who wrote a book called Death by Government. And he has a website. You look it up. It's very interesting. He estimates that over the entire course of the 20th century, about 170,000 innocent people were killed by what we call terrorists, non-state actors, which is a lot of people. But he says between 170 and 360 million innocent people were killed by states. You see, over the course of the 20th century. So if you look at the death of innocent people, states are much more culpable. But states can't be called terrorists because the definition of a state is having a legitimate monopoly over the use of force. So Hitler can be a war criminal maybe, although we don't even say that. Hitler could be a dictator, he could be a terrible guy. You never call Hitler a terrorist. You see? And so the language then is designed to focus on and demonize the non-state actors and to deflect attention from the non-state actors don't have armies. You know, so here the Pentagon it's the same thing as Israel, the victim. So here the Pentagon's budget is $1 trillion a year. The Pentagon's budget. And yet the Pentagon is for freedom and democracy, and the Taliban that are running around in the white pickup trucks are the big enemies. So we have to be aware of how we're manipulated, and I think conspiracy theory is one of the ways in which we manipulate ourselves. So we have to be aware when we're looking at that critically. If I see somebody who says, well, these people are responsible for this, what's behind that? And is it true? And the reality is always much more complex than that kind of thing.
But pursuit of the truth is the bottom line there.
Exactly.
I don't
The
think
critical pursuit.
we don't have that today.
That's right. No, that's right. But you have a lot of conspiracy theory.
Well, sure, but,
Yeah.
but we don't have the truth, and that's the whole point.
That's right.
Okay.
Jeff,
Kathy?
could you speak, you mentioned a bit about, you're talking about globalizing Palestine, and specifically the extent to which there is that relationship between Israeli military and policing security within the U.S. And I think we saw a lot of connections being made between Palestinians and protesters in Ferguson and the role of the military, militarized police there. And we're also seeing it with Standing Rock, the protectors of the land there. And so I'd like to have you talk more about how our police forces within this country are certainly being trained by the Israelis in terms of tactics and just what that impact is on our own society. Thanks.
Again, I'm putting the military security and policing in the same package, in a sense. And you see that very well with the militarization of the American police. I talk about a global pacification system. In a sense that we're being pacified. I mean, that's what the capitalist system is trying to do, is to pacify us. And it does it in all kinds of ways, where the military, I even have a mnemonic device, if you want to remember it. The missile complex. Missile meaning the military, internal security, like Homeland Security, surveillance, because the surveillance systems are amazing that exist today, intelligence, and law enforcement, that together make up the word missile. So it's an easy thing to remember. Now this is, in a sense, the coming together of these things that are meant to pacify us, so that the police forces are being militarized. There's that program 1033, if you know the program, where the American Army actually gives surplus equipment to American police forces. You have police forces in Idaho that have tanks. But there's a center, if you want to look into this more, there's a center called the Giley Center, Gilee, which is in Atlanta. It's called the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange Program. But it's located in Georgia, but it's actually nationwide. And they send American police forces to Israel. I have a slide of it. I'm not going to. So that if you go onto their website, or the Giley Center, you'll see all these American, including Minneapolis police, in the Knesset in Israel, in the Israeli police headquarters in Israel, learning about these kinds of weaponry, and it's funded by Home Depot. The guy that's, if you want a BDS target, although Home Depot might be too convenient to BDS, Bernard Marcus, who's the guy that started, that runs Home Depot, funds this program of bringing American police and training them in Israel, so that you've got those kinds of programs. But at the same time, I do want to show you something else. Here are your American police from the Giley program, but there's a lot of different The B'nai B'rith runs a law enforcement exchange program as well. There's a lot of these that bring the American police, you see, to Israel and bring Israeli police here. But look at something else that's going on. The Israel weapons industry, which is one of the major corporations in Israel, produces, among other things, the Uzi. Now, we all know the Uzi submachine gun. It's in every Schwarzenegger movie. Criminals love it. It's the preferred arm of drug cartels, and so on. So the Israel weapons industry that produces the Uzi submachine gun has opened a factory in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And what they're doing is they're taking military weapons and they're making them more compact. They're making them adaptable to police, to law enforcement. You see? So the next time your local police officer pulls you over, he or she could pull an Uzi submachine gun. You don't have to hold it with two hands anymore. Out of the holster. You see, so even the weaponry, you can see in the weaponry how it's being civilianized or police demilitarized. And of course, the American public is a huge market for Israel. For these, So let me give you just one more example of this. This is the X-95, made by the Israel Weapons Industries in its factory in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. You see, which is a combination assault rifle, carbine, and submachine gun. All right. Now, why a carbine? You know what a carbine is? You're from Minnesota, you should. But I didn't really know. A carbine is a normal rifle. You go deer hunting with a carbine. It's a normal rifle. So why are they putting that in an assault rifle and submachine gun? Because in the United States, even in the United States, listen, you have to be armed. So all this creates that kind of paranoia. That's what a security state thrives on, is paranoia. And Israel is more than happy to feed into that paranoia and provide the weaponry, because it's a market. And that's why I'm saying the capitalist part of this is completely disconnected from the actual. In other words, they create threats, they create paranoia, they create these militarization campaigns among the police in order to make money. We see it in order to protect us. You see, that's where we accept the security state, because our government should be protecting us. But in fact, our government and the ruling classes are complicit in creating and generating that fear that is then feeding into the militarism for the express purpose of profit. That's it. And so that's where we have to kind of shift our ways of looking at things, and we have to be more articulate than this and bring this out to the public, I think. And the police is a very good way to do it, because the police are local. So when you start to talk about the Minneapolis police being trained by Israel, that should be a BDS target. Now let's see from the police, what have they been trained in? What kinds of weapons is the Minneapolis police using? And begin at home to start to uncover this whole kind of a thing, and that would bring it home to people, and then connect it to the occupation and Israel. And that's what I mean, kind of by that's where BDS can be used to connect the dots, but bring it home and to say the occupation is here. Because let me just say one more thing quick. In Israel, we have a slogan that we're all Palestinians. And we mean that in the sense of solidarity with the Israeli left. I'm not saying all Israelis subscribe to that. Meaning that we're in solidarity with the Palestinians. But you could argue, and it's a good line to use, that literally we're all Palestinians. In the sense that we're all on the receiving end, through our police forces even, of weapons and tactics and surveillance systems, security systems that have been perfected on the Palestinians. So don't think that, Israel attacked Gaza and Gaza is the end of the story. Gaza was simply the laboratory.
Okay.
But you're the end users, you see? And so in that way, we bring the people here, the public, into the equation, where you're the targets as well. And I think that brings a critical aspect to this whole thing.
But I think we cannot redefine the goals of the BDS movement, and I don't think it's accurate to say that the goals of the BDS movement are outdated. I think they're super relevant, and it's not, the line of the goal is not just occupation, it's occupation and colonization of Arab lands, and colonization, as you well know, is totally ongoing.
Okay, thank you.
It's a comment, and you can...
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, very good. No, it's not that they're irrelevant, the goals of BDS, but I think they're too confining. I mean, if you go to the BDS, the BNC, the BDS National Committee in Ramallah, they'll tell you, we don't advocate for a particular solution because we don't want to divide the BDS movement. But you see, I don't get that, because the BDS movement is not a standalone thing. The BDS movement is a tool towards something. Towards what? So to say end the occupation, okay, I mean, first of all, it's not going to happen, I think. But okay, let's say end the occupation is still a goal. But what does that mean? That's not a political program. What does end the occupation mean? Does it mean 5 states, 1 state? Does it mean transferring the Palestinians to Jordan? I mean, ending the occupation can mean a lot of things, and not always good things. Israel thinks it's ended the occupation. So that I think we have to really begin to develop a political program. So if we succeed, and we do begin to break this thing down, which I think we have to do, and create new possibilities, that we're ready. And I'll tell you why this is urgent, just in a word. You know, the left, we tend, and I know us, unfortunately, we're not connected to what's happening politically. We kind of stand aside, and we do our writing and our analysis, and but we're not engaged very much. And so we're not connected to the historical moment. What's going to happen is that the Palestinian Authority is going to collapse or end. It's not sustainable. Abu Mazen is 80-some years old. It's corrupt. It's lost all its credibility. The Palestinian Authority is what's holding the lid on today. I'm not blaming it. It didn't do the occupation, but it's holding the lid on because it's allowing this two-state discourse to continue. And of course, the PA is doing Israel's policing work. The PA is Israel's policeman. It's a collaborationist regime. It's going to fall. When it falls, and it could happen tomorrow, or it could happen next week, or it could happen I don't have a timeline. It could be that Israel will annex Area C, that it's on the cusp of, and that will precipitate the fall of the PA. Or the PA could fall for other reasons, and then Israel would annex Area C. I mean, all these things are coming. We know it's coming down the pipeline. And we're not ready. We're not. The Israeli army has, if you look in Haaretz newspaper today, look at the website today. There's an article about how the Israeli government and the army has been preparing for a year over the imminent collapse of the PA. They know, they're preparing. Where are we? What, we're saying we don't have a solution? That means we're not actors in this drama. The Palestinians are not sitting down with each other, our partners, to say, what do we do the day after the PA collapses? Well, then we start to scramble and try to figure out what's going on. And what about? And they're not talking to us. There's this whole anti-normalization thing going on. And in general, I think the problem of the left is that I don't think we see ourselves as actors, and so we have the privilege of old-fashioned slogans and saying we don't want a political solution. We don't have to deliver anything. And that's what I'm trying to also struggle with, to tell you the truth. So I think this is urgent because we know the PA is going to collapse sometime soon. And I'll tell you what's going to happen. I think I know what's going to happen. And that's this. that, just in a word, that Israel's going to annex Area C. Okay, that's pretty easy to predict. In fact, Israel could do that before the end of the PA. Wait, just let me show you this, and then I'll do it real. What's going to happen is this. I think that Israel will annex Area C, so that it expands into 85% of the country. I don't know if it's at the level of negotiations yet, but certain feelers, and with Hamas is ready, I think, and I'm saying this on the basis of information I had. Hamas is ready to do a separate peace with Israel. If Israel would allow a Palestinian state to emerge in Gaza under Hamas rule, they're willing to give up the West Bank. You know, Hamas has its own agenda, and Israel. And if last week, again, it's all, you know, between the lines. Last week, Lieberman, Victor Lieberman, this crazy Russian fascist defense minister we have, was talking about Israel building a seaport and an airport in Gaza. You see, these things are happening. So what could happen is that Israel annexes Area C, Gaza becomes an independent state of its own, and then we're left with A and B. First of all, A and B is not an Israeli problem. We don't want Ramallah. We don't want Tulkarm. It's not our problem, right? So Israel can say it's over. We're walking away. We have what we want. It's over. And then what will happen, I think, and there's all kinds of indications about this, is that the U.S. and Europe, working through the United Nations, will declare an international protectorate over areas A and B. And they'll say Palestinians have to be protected, Palestinians aren't ready for self-governance, Palestinians don't have a viable economy. There's all kinds of ways you can put it. And you'll have an internationally sanctioned apartheid regime, but with Israel, that Israel has nothing to do with. It's shifted it all to the UN. This is where I think we're going. I think we're going towards an expanded Israel, cutting off Gaza from the rest of it, and imprisoning Palestinians under an international protectorate in areas A and B. That's where we're going. What's our response? What if this happens? Then we're going to start organizing? We know this is happening. Why aren't we being proactive? So I accept what you're saying, and I agree. And in a sense, it's not fair what I'm saying, in that, like what I started to say before. You're not the audience that has to do that. You're not responsible for formulating where we're going. That's our job. But one of the problems is we're not doing it today, and it's leaving you kind of rudderless and directionless a little bit, and I think that's something we have to resolve.
Okay, I have a question for you, which is, you focused on the Palestinian side, but the two aspects about Israel that I'm interested to find out.
Can you speak a little louder?
Okay, my question, two questions. One, how is it that the Israeli leadership has behaved like an ostrich fashion, ignoring what's the absolutely ironical results of their policies? But the more importantly, the Israeli public, why has it continued to elect these conservative governments? So seeing the reality of what's going on, it doesn't make sense. Why has Israeli public continued to accept when they all know that the result of this is going to be a state with Jews in minority? So I just can't understand this, that what's going on in the Israeli public. You've talked about Palestine and West Bank, but please could you elaborate on both the leadership and the public?
Well, the Israeli public buys what the government is saying, and that is, again, that it's over. We won. There's nothing else that we won. The Palestinians are isolated, they're neutralized, they're under their own collaborationist regime that we set up. Israel and the United States set up the Palestinian Authority, and it's over. It's hard for me to convey this to you. You know, some people say, people say to me, could you give this talk in Tel Aviv? And the answer is yes, but nobody would come. This issue is 100 times more alive in Minneapolis than it is in Tel Aviv or Haifa. It's a non-issue there. The Israelis have said it's over. We have nothing more to do. The Arabs are terrorists, we know that. The army will take care of them. We have a wall, and we have American support. So we're washing our hands of this, and we're going home. You know, in the last election, there was a poll in Haaretz newspaper, and I have to say with pride that my middle son is an editor in Haaretz. So, but that aside. There was a poll in Haaretz newspaper about what the Israeli electorate is voting on. What are the major issues? And what we're talking about, peace, Palestinians, occupation, all of that, was number 11 on the list. It's not on the Israeli mind. They don't care. They think it could be happening in in the Congo. That's how far away the West Bank and Gaza are from Israel. So that they have no motivation to go on beyond. And that's why I'm in Minneapolis and not in Tel Aviv. Because our view is that there's nothing to do with the Israeli public. It isn't only that they're not against. I don't think, like I said before, I think you could convince the Israeli public to go to one binational democratic state. The problem is they just don't give a shit. They don't care. Because it's not an issue. It's like if I would ask you, did you hear about the terrible earthquake in Haiti? Of course, yes. But I mean, it's so removed from our lives that, maybe we'll give some money immediately, but it's not something, and that's the way the Israelis feel about Palestine. Yeah, I know there's demolitions. I've heard vaguely this or that, but it has nothing to do with me. It's far away, and let the army deal with it. So that's why I'm saying, that's why you're partners, because the only way out, I think, is if we, Palestinians and critical Israelis, mobilize you internationally to create the pressures on Israel that have to be created in order for us to get beyond the occupation to something just. But it's not fair, but the Israeli public are simply not actors. And there's nothing to do with Israel. And they'll vote for, they don't like Netanyahu. The Israeli public, I don't think, is particularly right-wing. They have no alternative because there's no Labor Party anymore. There's no opposition. And so everybody is just in Israel is kind of hunkering down and just, but at the same time, they're not, somebody mentioned the Holocaust or something, they're not fearful, the Israeli public. They're not traumatized, the Israeli Jewish public. They're not worried. They're living a good life. I mean, if I could take you to Ben Yehuda Street in Jerusalem on a Friday night, it's more calm than Minneapolis. You have less of a police presence on the streets of Jerusalem than you have in Minneapolis. So that's the problem I think we're facing. And that's why I'm not focusing. I know the Israelis are the problem. I'm not trying to obviously blame the Palestinians. But what I'm saying is, when you have an adversary like that, we have to be more strategic. And that means, obviously in this circle I'm emphasizing what we should be doing and taking it for granted that the Israelis are doing what they're doing, which is winning, in a sense.
There are a lot of questions, and I would like to call on Dennis, Dennis and Randy and the gentleman over there. So just some of you, I don't know that we'll get to all the questions, but let's go Dennis, Randy, and the gentleman over there.
I'll try to be more specific.
I think you've made so many very, very, very good points. But one question I have for you is that I think I haven't heard you say much about the UN. And I wonder, given we're all in our silos, as you mentioned, and we all have our points of view, and injustice flourishes throughout the world. The UN perhaps doesn't seem to care that its resolutions are violated constantly for 4, 5, and 6 decades, etc. Should we just forget about the UN? Because the US obviously is not going to push it.
That's right. Well, I mean, the UN, the problem with the UN, of course, is that it's not an independent agency. It's really dependent on the Security Council. So, the General Assembly can make any resolution it wants to, but it has no authority. It's the Security Council that does, and there you have the American veto. So you remember, most of you, example, but in all kinds of, like you're saying, Israeli research is Israel is outside of the United States has more companies on NASDAQ than any other country in the world, more than Britain and France. And these are all obviously in the security. I mean, a lot of them are dual use stuff. Nanotechnology is also used for biomedicine. It's the same thing. The GPS where you found your way here today is also the guidance system for weapons, for missiles. So but this is really the Israeli contribution. It's called the Startup Nation. There's even a book called Israel, the Startup Nation. And it's because these are all byproducts of the military.
Is a bag of Minnesota gifts for Jeff, made or grown in Minnesota, so we want to thank him. And would you thank him, please?
So let's thank you. No, thanks for inviting me. Thanks to Kathy and all of you and the organizations that brought me here. And I'm sharing this because I see us all in the same team. And we're all active and we're all committed. And I hope that what I said, even though it's critical, was simply food for thought. It's meant to be a constructive criticism and analysis. And hopefully we can build on it and we'll be in touch with each other. So thank you very much. All right.